All right, Emily, hit me. What are we talking about today?
Emily is on vacation.
Oh, well, very nice of you to fill in for her. Daniel, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about the biggest expenses people plan to fail for, when staying in cash actually makes sense, and then discussing if clients actually want planners to be more therapeutic.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. All right, Daniel, you're going to have to tell me what emergency has befallen you such that you are worried that you have not adequately prepared for it.
No immediate emergencies, fingers crossed and knocking on wood, but I did get this question from somebody pretty close to me recently, and I think they were looking for a one word answer. And before I knew it, I was talking for 15 minutes. So I figured, hey, this might be a pretty good podcast topic. So there's a lot of large expenses families and individuals plan or fail to plan for. And I could say that could be broken down into three different, age groups. I'd say first would be the young professionals, people just getting into their career or even not even starting their career yet. I'd say midlifers, so those that are well developed in their career and probably have some children and an established home. And then I'd say retirees, that third group of folks, also have some large expenses they plan to fail for. So, first and foremost, starting with the young professional group, what do you see in terms of expenses that are just unnecessarily large or simply not noticed when they're reviewing their budget?
The trick of being a young person is that a lot of decisions are made when you're young. There's a funny thing in the financial planning world where some people will talk to financial planners who work with people who are not just retired or multimillionaires, and they'll be like, what do you do for young people? And it's hilarious because young people have possibly the most going on as far as decisions go. And I think your question really hits at one of them, which is not so much a specific expense. I can give you a bunch of examples here in a moment, but a failure to build up a financial position early in life. So we talked a little bit last time about the act of college being a dissaving activity where you borrow money and use so on and so forth. But college students or kind of young adults have a superpower, and I think they relinquish it very, very easily, which is a shame because the superpower is living on very little. Particularly if they've just, let's say, worked part time while they were in school or something like that. And so what happens is they graduate college, or they get a promotion, or they finish trade school, whatever it is, and they get the offer, right? The big offer where their income is going to go from four figures or low five figures a year to 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, $80,000 a year. And their first act is to spend all of it. Not literally, but to be like, oh, I'm getting a great job. I'm going to move to Atlanta. I'm going to have an apartment. I can afford this much. So I'm going to spend that much. I can then, get a new car because I've been driving the beater I got from my parents when I was 16. And, suddenly, boom, all their money is spent. They've budgeted it all out and they are having a great life. And they failed to build up a capital position for the car accident or for the hailstorm or for the sudden layoff or the fall through of that job or the promotion that doesn't come. So, in particular terms for young people, almost any financial catastrophe that you can think of, from a car accident to a job loss, anything can pretty much crush them financially and put them in a position to very quickly fall into debt that lasts them for years or even over decades. So functionally, I think the thing that young people fail to save for is life. It's a contact sport. It's going to come at them hard and fast, and ultimately, they are not going to have control over when the big thing is going to happen. So largely, realistically for a young person, the biggest obligation is just, hey, you need to save for that thing you are absolutely not planning on having happen to you, because inevitably before you're 30, at least one big ticket item is going to pop up, and it could be just about anything.
Planning for life. I love that. And, I think with young folks too, a big thing that we see is kind of like you mentioned, they're going from part-time work in college or high school to this big jump in income. And with that, they look at all the things that they've been deferring in their life. They've been probably subsidized by their parents for a large portion of their life. And now for the first time, they have disposable income and they want to use it. So how do you strike that balance between saving for life and planning for life, but also utilizing this new income you have in a way that you can enjoy it.
I think realistically, the best thing that somebody can do for themselves right out of school or right into that first job is to pretend your income hasn't changed as much as you can manage. Now, there's a bit of a gotcha here, right? Let's say you were living in an apartment that your parents were paying for while you were in college or something. That doesn't quite work as well if you now have to start paying for your apartment. But essentially, just trying to keep your lifestyle one step behind your position in your career or your position in your income. So when you get your first post college job, keep acting like a college student. When you get your first promotion, then you can act like you just got your first post college job in terms of your finances. If we can just stay one step behind, then we very carefully are able to avoid inflating our lifestyle because it's very easy to grow into an income. It's very hard to grow out of an income. There's sort of a thing that's very funny to hear as a financial planner, which is people saying, I just don't know how we can get by on less than $200,000 a year. And you think of your other clients or your friends, your family members who don't, spend more than 30,000 a year because they don't make more than 30,000 a year. So it's all a question of expectations and lifestyle. And if we can ultimately just try to deliberately delay our gratification just a little bit, just by staying one step behind. So to give you an example, let's say you were making, $20,000 working, I'll say very, very part time, if not outright full time while you're in school. Maybe you're working in a tipped industry or something where the money can be pretty decent if you really hustle. But if you're transitioning from that type of income to, let's say, a $50,000 income, that's $30,000 of bandwidth. That's $30,000 of means that you didn't have previously, that you didn't need to live on previously. And if you can commit to saving even just half of that, whether it's in checking savings or a brokerage or into your hopefully new shiny 401k and retirement plan at work, that's going to do a huge amount of work for you over the course of the rest of your lifetime, just to have built up that financial buffer early on instead of living paycheck to paycheck, even as your income grows to many multiples of where it started.
I remember when I was in school, at college being, my junior, senior year, I had an apartment, and I wouldn't consider it the nicest place in the world by, the average standard. It looked like a college place, but it it brings me back to what you just said. If those first few years you can kind of taper your lifestyle back to what you're used to and what you had in college, maybe not to that extreme, you can probably, have your cake and eat it too. I know the white coat investor quotes this a lot, saying live like a resident as a recommendation to attending physicians for their first few years out of school, because very similar to some college graduates, they receive a large income increase and yeah, they have to save a portion of it, but they also want to enjoy their lives. So let's transition. Sorry, Dan, you had something to say there.
No, I mean, I was going to say I empathize with it a lot. My wife and I are multimillionaires. And we both still drive 10-year-old plus, almost 20-year-old plus Priuses in her case.
I've been in the car. It still drives great. So no reason to change there. So transitioning a little bit to midlifers, maybe let's say that hypothetical individual did save and they did some great things in their early years of their career. Now they have a couple kids, maybe they're looking or already have a house. What are the big expenses here?
So, I think Gen X is a really good example in our current timeline of people who are running into this problem. Gen X has been quite famously known as the sandwich generation, in which they are being caught between the twin pressures of their children becoming old enough to go to college and the obligation or the pressure to pay for college, and conversely, being caught between boomer and traditionalist parents, depending on their exact age, who have not financially adequately saved for their own retirement or their own needs. And so they then have their parents moving in with them, or they need to financially support their parents. The biggest expenses here tend to not be your own expenses; they tend to be other people's expenses. When you have a kid, you think, well, gosh, who knows if this kid is going to grow up to be the next Einstein, or if I have a future delinquent in my household, who knows? It's a tiny bundle of joy. And so a lot of people don't save for college until many, many years later on. Many parents also start to sort of sacrifice their kids' college as a saving item in lieu of other financial priorities like a second home or home updates and renovations and so on. So there's a lot of things that can sort of distract from the saving for something like college. And then conversely, the parents' savings Unfortunately, you just don't have a lot of power over that. That can be caused by any number of circumstances. Maybe your parents didn't have strong incomes. Maybe they had a big health issue later on in life that really just sucked up all their money. Maybe they made some bad investments, trusted the wrong people, or they've been scammed. There's a million reasons why your parents might kind of fall in on you. So the question becomes, how do you hedge against these? How do you mitigate against these? Number one, on the side of the children, we need to avoid lifestyle creep as pertains to the children. It's very easy to get stuck keeping up with the Joneses when it comes to your kids' activities, right? They want to be on softball team, then they want to be on track and field. Then there's a trip to, for summer to spend a month in Germany and all these other things. And you want the best for your children. So it's very easy to get pulled into kind of immediate, I'll say, gratification or enrichment in this particular element for your children that sometimes can then derail our savings. We would be funding the 529 plan for our kids, but instead we'd rather sign them up for Aikido lessons or piano or whatever it is. Not to say that's not a good investment, but just the trade offs there can sometimes be how we rationalize, right? If I'm paying for all this stuff now, I'm not going to save for this cost later. On the side of parents, you don't have a lot of power here. So fundamentally, it's to get aware of the risks early. It's to talk to your parents. It's to get an understanding of their financial position as quickly as possible, and not like a vague like, oh, we'll be fine, honey, don't worry about it. Like, no, mom, dad, I love you, but I am worried that one day I'm going to have you living on my couch, or that I'm going to have to pay for your retirement home bills. So respectfully, can we have a really serious, honest, open conversation about, your financial assets, your saving, whether you have long-term care insurance, pensions, all that sort of stuff. So that, number one, as you get older, I can help you with it. But number two, so that I have a clearer picture of whether I need to account for your potential needs in the future as part of my own planning. And that's a tough conversation to be had. I think the most crying that has ever happened in my office is not the middle-aged people we're talking about right now, but is the parents in this conversation. They are so, gosh, every parent I've ever met over the age of 60 or 70 is just terrified of being a burden on their children. So many of them are scared to have the conversation or embarrassed or ashamed, but it becomes very, very important for you to have clarity on their financial picture so that you can be in a position to be prepared to help them if that need arises.
Those conversations really are tough when you have to rationalize and start to discuss some of these trade-offs, whether it's paying for the child to go to college, or paying for your own retirement, or funding some care for your parents. And it's a really good point. You can have anything you want if you do financial planning well, but it's very difficult to have everything at once. And I think that's a big problem with a lot of these midlifers is they don't just have children, they also have these adult parents, and they're getting pulled in both directions. But at the same time, they also need to make sure they're taking care of themselves, and having those difficult conversations can hopefully help with some of that. And I know it's not easy, and it really never will be, unfortunately. So the third group here, Dan, is going to be retirees. So these are the folks, either gearing up to retirement, starting to get those AARP envelopes in the mail, and maybe even those already in retirement too. What do we see here for large, either unplanned or just large expenses in general?
The irony is group number two turns into group number three, and the cause of the problems for group number two often becomes the cause of the problems for group number three. Despite what I just said about the middle-aged group as far as saving for kids' college, taking care of parents, etc., some people going into the phase of pre-retirement or retirement do sacrifice themselves to help with phase two. They say we will pay for our kids' college, no matter what they want to study, no matter what school they want to go to, no matter how many years it takes them to finish. They say I will support my parents unconditionally because I love them, and hopefully you do love your parents. And so I'm willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars a year to pay for their care, or to update my home so they can live in my home, and so on. Or I'll forego career opportunities to be more present for my parents and my family. And there is a financial consequence to that results in the problems that we often see for group number three. For the pre-retiree and retiree, ironically, the answer here is not a big mystery. The retirees fail to save adequately for retirement. The retirees fail to prepare for the non-lifestyle costs of being at an advanced age. So things like healthcare, cost of daily living, transportation, all the various things that sort of emerge as you, through no fault of your own, get older. And once again, through no fault of your own, some warranties begin to expire. And then long-term care. the economics on long-term care insurance and planning are really tough to sell as a financial planner because we can show our clients that essentially, when you're, let's say, 95, if you go into a long-term care facility based on your current means and savings and so on, you'll be bankrupt by the time you're 97. And they always go like, oof, that's a lot. And they'll say, well, the way to solve this would be something like a long-term care insurance policy. Let me show you the cost of that and the benefit of that. And they go, oof, that's more money than I want to spend, so I'm just going to risk it. I cannot begin to tell you how many people entering retirement, in retirement, both clients and just people I've talked to, have essentially decided to self insure something like long term care. And fundamentally, if they do live long enough, it will bankrupt them. Almost without a doubt. Some people do have the means to self insure for substantial periods of time. The average American absolutely does not. And so it is a really material and major concern in planning, not only to save enough money to retire on, but also then to be able to afford the potential issues that arise with just getting to an older age. As far as how you prep and plan for that, all of this goes back to the very first person. Did you start saving for retirement right out of college or even while you were still in college? Did you do it consistently through your lifetime instead of making little compromises where you quit saving for a while so you could buy a boat or buy a second home? Did you do it consistently and persistently over a lifetime? The greatest irony in financial planning is, when somebody comes to you and they're 55 or 60, we're usually pretty close to a phase where what we've got is what we've got, and we've got to problem solve with the resources on hand. And ironically, when you do financial planning for 22 or 23-year-olds, and yes, I've done financial plans for 22 and 23-year-olds, their plan is almost self-solving if they exhibit the appropriate saving behavior early on in life. Almost every problem that could possibly arise for them will be solved simply by contributing to that 401k at a reasonable savings rate and controlling their costs of living. Wham, bam, done. And the irony then is, for retirees, the best solution to their problem is decades expired. And so planning for saving enough for retirement, planning for your potential healthcare needs, planning that one day, if you live long enough, you might need some help, really is quite a challenge in practice at the time, whereas solving problems for the middle age, solving problems for younger folks is a sort of problem and solution that happen concurrently.
No, we see it all the time. Clients come in their 50s, 60s, and it's the same thing every time. It's, wow, I wish I knew about this 10 years ago, or I wish I had started doing this earlier. It's never, wow, I should have saved later. And I think that's a really good point. How about just in general? Let's forget about the age groups for a second. What are just some common expenses you see people simply spending too much on, whether it's coffee, or just eating out too much?
The funny thing is, it's never something like coffee. There's a whole like latte effect. If you just didn't buy your Starbucks every day, you'd be a millionaire, blah, blah, blah. I'll say junk advice that looks really nice in headlines, but in practice makes no material difference. I think the biggest mistakes people make are buying more house than they need. I think that is a huge one because that can often trap them in a situation where they are, simply overspending on their home, and that cuts into their ability to reasonably save for their other needs. I think at the same time, not buying a home as early as reasonably possible based on their lifestyle or life status is another issue. That isn't to say everybody needs to go buy a home. You really need to stay in a home for, I'd say, no less than 5 or 6 years to even just break even on that investment with the cost of the transaction and so on. So functionally, it makes a lot of sense to really just be certain about your longevity in a position, the security of your position before you do it. But in turn, waiting until you're 30, 40, 50, 60 can be something that really causes a big issue further on down the road. I think people overindulging in not necessarily quality of life items, but in the sort of rationalization of trade offs, right? So, back to what I've commented on earlier in this conversation, not saving early enough for retirement, or pausing saving for your kids' college so you can put them in ballet lessons, or deciding that you need to have a new car or lease a car over and over and over again instead of just driving your car into the ground. there's a certain level of income where you can indulge in any of these behaviors and make up for the difference later on. But ultimately, we tend to over-index on things that we enjoy and things that we want. We tend to downplay our risks and concerns, and then we end up in one or two camps. Either the risks and concerns don't happen, and so over-indexing on the things we wanted and enjoyed works out just fine, or we, through luck, kind of just poor luck or the roll of the dice, end up having bad things happen that we didn't adequately plan and prepare for, and it really upsets and derails our lives quite significantly.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks, Dan. So, been working here for about 3 months now, Dan. Come across a couple of clients who I would say hold on to a little bit more cash than we'd probably recommend for their plan. Now, it's a very nuanced thing and it's very personal depending on the family you're working with. But I wanted to talk about some times when maybe holding on to a little bit of cash actually might make sense for some families.
Sure. So I think the easiest way to approach this is to, first and foremost, just to understand kind of how we would talk about constructing an emergency fund and how we would define that. And I know we've touched on that in previous episodes, but for anybody who's just listening fresh or who just doesn't remember what the advice was there, and then we can talk about sort of where it makes sense to hold on to extra in that particular context. So basic structure and emergency fund, as far as we would advise on, we want to ensure that somebody just has as a baseline a month of their expenses in checking, and your paycheck goes on top of that. So it's not going from zero to paycheck, zero to paycheck. It's 1 month of expenses plus paycheck on a going basis, and then you spend down to that 1 month of expenses, and your paycheck comes in again. Uh, from beyond that, having about the next 2 months of lifestyle expenses in a high yield savings or a money market. In this current environment, that means earning, I would say, a minimum of 4.25% or 4.5%. That if you have a bank that's paying you less than 2%, what you have is a financial abuser. That's just my opinion, but functionally, there's plenty of financial institutions that will pay you a healthy rate of return in excess of inflation. So there's no reason to let your money rot at the bank for the benefit of that bank. By extension from that, as far as then kind of what we need to do with extra, what I just described is sort of a 3 month emergency fund. We've touched previously on individuals wanting 3 to 6 months, on married couples wanting essentially 3 months per member of the couple, and then recognizing the imbalance of income. But in practice, then the question that you're asking here is, when does it make sense to hold on to more cash? And the answer there is there anything that is time sensitive happening in, call it, the next 5 years or so? So, for example, if I want to buy a house next year, I should not be putting my savings into the stock market to try to kind of boost my savings, because the probability within a short 1 year, 2 year time frame is that the market could be very much up, it could be very much down. And if it's up, great, you can buy that much more house or put that much more down payment down. But conversely, if it's not up at that time, then you're not buying a house, or you're buying a lot less house, or you're not going to be able to afford to put the down payment you want. So we want to remove uncertainty within that kind of 5 year time frame. If it's something just like, I always wanted to buy, a really expensive, nice car, but I have a perfectly adequate car, so it's not really time sensitive, you might invest for that purpose. But realistically, if it's something where we need to have a fixed amount of capital on a specific date or within a specific short time frame, we should not be indulging in the risks of the stock market. We should be utilizing more secure options like money markets, like CDs, paying in excess of inflation, that will align to a secure and sort of stable glide path into having the capital we need at the time we need it, 6 months out, 2 years out, whatever that time frame is.
So when you were talking there, I thought of another question. You said 3 to 6 months of expenses, roughly, give or take. But a good portion of our clients and folks who work with either are business owners or simply have variable income from sales. How does that work in that 3 to 6 month expense rule?
I think the business owner, people variable income, have to lean on that even more, if not even more significantly. So I'll use realtors as the example. I've worked with probably 2 dozen realtors at this point as financial planning clients, and I would say 90% of them are behaving as if they are living paycheck to paycheck in terms of a boom and bust cycle, right? So we'll talk to agents. Agents will regularly tell us, if they're engaging us as planners, oh, I made 230,000 last year, I made 320,000 last year, I made $450,000 last year, And then we'll go through the financial planning process and gather their data and look at their status. And they've got less than $100,000 in the bank, no retirement savings. They own a house that's they've only lived in for the last 3 years, and they have a brand new car they bought with them last year, a brand new leased car. And so the behavior there is, they go through these cycles of boom and bust, or kind of abundance and poverty, where when the abundance happens, they inflate their lifestyle, they change homes, they buy a new car, they take great vacations around the country and so on. And conversely, when they are having a bad time, the market's not good, the deals aren't happening, I'm going through a dry spell right now, they still enjoy all the things they had, but they just sort of go into a hoarding mode. And so, ironically, they might be going through periods where they have $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 essentially in their checking, but they are not trying to smooth their consumption out over time. Instead, they just overindulge during the good times, and then they sort of tighten things down in the bad times, rather than trying to strike a healthier estimate of what a sort of mean is, or an average is, across the good and the bad times, and trying to sort of smooth out their savings, their cash flows, and so on over those time periods, and living within the means of the average, as opposed to overindulging in the good times and tightening down in the bad times. So for an emergency fund, or for holding onto cash, same sort of rules apply here. High yield savings, money markets, maybe some very short term CDs, like 3 or 6 month CDs if there's enough cash on hand. But functionally, a cash flow analysis and really projecting what cash flow looks like over the next 12 to 24 months is hugely important for people who are realtors, or in sales, or are business owners who have non-recurring or highly volatile revenue sources, because ultimately it's easy to sort of get flush with cash and overspend during those times, and conversely, it's very hard to turn that off during the down times. So often then what will become a byproduct of poor planning here is that we'll have a boom moment, we'll overindulge, the low times will show up. We don't know it's the low times yet, so we'll just start using credit cards or spending all of our cash. And then we get to another boom period, and then we waste half of the boon of that boom period paying off debts accrued during the down times.
So while you were talking there, Dan, I just looked up very quickly uh, retirement model portfolios, and I'm taking a look at some of these pie charts, and I see that a lot of them have allocations with anywhere from 5 to 10% of the portfolio in cash. Now, is this different from the emergency fund that you were referring to earlier, or is this where you would keep that money?
So I find that these are perhaps a little poorly explained, and that sort of makes the question here a good question to ask. I think a common piece of advice from a financial planner for somebody entering retirement or trying to get into retirement is to advise on having some version of a way to bridge over bad market periods. So let's say you have $1 million and you're planning on living on sort of a classic 4% distribution rule. So you say, I'm going to take $40,000 out a year. It would not be uncommon for a financial planner to suggest something like putting $40,000 to $80,000 into high yield savings, money markets, and CDs, and then trying to live on distributions of the remaining, call it $920,000 in that scenario, rather than having it all in the market and allocating it, and being still trying to live on sort of the 4% of the full million. Because the idea here would be, hey, if a bad time comes to the market and suddenly we go from $1 million to $800,000, we've still got 40 or $80,000, 2 years of your expenses sort of sitting in reserve. And so we'll just stop taking money out of the volatile part of the portfolio, and we'll start distributing from the more stable portion. Now, what I just described then in a portfolio pie chart could show up as a 4% or an 8% allocation to cash. But I think in terms of then how you think of your retirement portfolio, cash is an asset class, but I don't know that we think of it as an investment asset. Just there's sort of a human psychology element that goes into that. I think having a strong cash moat between you and the volatility of your portfolio is very valuable. But at the same time, I don't know that you need to have a moat that is equivalent to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of your potential retirement needs. I think that is a classic mistake in which people have so much cash or so many fixed value assets in their portfolio that they essentially handicap the growth of their portfolio by preparing for an apocalypse that probably will never come. in terms of needing to bridge over a 5 year, 10 year, 15-year financial downturn. Because ultimately, this comes down to a level of comfort with volatility. Some people are going to go 100% pension with something like para and be 100% in their pension and just get a paycheck and sort of cover their ears when the market happens. And some people are going to stay on the rail the whole time and stay fully, stock market heavy, volatility, equity invested throughout retirement. But that cash buffer becomes a very important part of the safety net in that type of structure. Whereas for the person in the pension, ironically, I often see people who have a strong pension still be very conservative for their investments because they're not thinking of this stream of inexhaustible income as a secure or low risk asset. And so they tend to be something like 90% conservative, 10% aggressive in their aggregate portfolio, when in fact on the investment side, they should probably be 100% aggressive because their portfolio might be only a quarter of their overall net worth.
It's really interesting because, too little cash can completely derail your financial situation. And too much cash might look great today because you're not seeing a lot of fluctuations, but is almost certain to derail your financial future later in life. So getting the appropriate amount of cash is extremely important. Thank you for discussing that a little bit. I personally am really excited about this last topic and your perspective on it here, Dan. It's this topic of clients and families we work with and what they want out of planners and if they truly do want planners to be more therapeutic in their relationship. And, money is a highly nuanced and individual topic for everybody. There's certain pain points, emotions, and fears that come up, and they're highly nuanced between individuals. But all that being said, do clients actually want their financial planners to take on a little bit more of a therapeutic role in their relationship with money?
All right. So I'm going to give I'll say a proactive shout out, recognition, and apology to some of my colleagues in the financial academia space here, because I want to make sure I recognize them very directly before I share my thoughts on this. So. Megan Lertz, Sonia Luder, Megan McCoy, Christy Archuleta, Michael Kofkota, everybody in the financial therapy world who does incredible research on this area, who has written extensively and researched extensively on how therapeutic practices can help clients and improve client outcomes. You are the real ones, and I appreciate your work so very much, and you're all very wonderful people. That said, I think the average financial planner is deluding themselves when they try to act as their client's therapist or apply therapeutic techniques. And the reason I say that is because financial psychology has become very, I'll say, sexy, very interesting, very consumer friendly, and very advisor friendly as an area of study. There are some, I'll say, thought leaders, and I'm putting enormous quote marks around these unnamed people when I say thought leaders, who have made it their full time business to share financial psychology, behavioral finance techniques and tactics and studies and research. And people, and particularly in the planning community, are lapping it up because it's interesting, it's fun, it's fascinating. It's sort of an exciting area. It's new, it's fresh, and it's something to think about or focus on instead of tax efficiency or portfolio optimization or rebalancing. So I understand the appeal. However, my deepest concern when we think about trying to be more therapeutic as financial planners is that though one of the greatest value propositions we have is helping our clients manage their behavior in terms of keeping them from making mistakes, guiding them to be less anxious or concerned about their finances. In turn, we financial planners are ill educated and poorly experienced in therapeutic work, right? To be a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a professional counselor involves thousands of clinical hours, involves bachelor's, graduate, doctoral level studies, requires huge amounts of supervision and training. And what many financial planners are doing when we think about being therapeutic is we read a blog that said, instead of asking your client, how much money they have to invest, ask them, why are they investing? And that is not a bad question. We love to ask our own versions of those questions, but I think it is deeply, deeply problematic that we have started to see the profession get, I think, a little bit distracted by these fun, squishy topics when we are not well trained to execute or implement on these strategies and these tactics.
I don't plan on going out tomorrow and doing thousands of hours of training to get up to speed on the therapeutic part of the relationship. But what skills or training might financial planners want to acquire to, bridge the gap a little bit and also help those clients with some of the behavioral aspects of their plan?
So I think the certified financial therapist or CFTI or CFT1 certification is probably the gold standard here as far as a strong education. There are some good behavioral finance curricula out there. So you also have like the BFA, I think it's behavioral financial advisor, behavioral financial analyst. So there's a couple designations and educational programs to help financial planners become better at this. You have the RLP, the Registered Life Planner, which is not academically based, is not actual psychiatry or psychology driven. It's more squishy, sort of building financial plans around like the life your clients want to live and helping them kind of self actualize as part of financial planning. So I think there's plenty of places to go for education on this. I think learning the techniques and the tactics, I think staying aware of financial psychology is valuable. Behavioral finances and financial psychology of financial planning have become topics for the CFP exam. But I think there is a keen difference between getting educated on this topic and implementing. I think the best thing financial planners can do is get really educated on this topic and know when they need to take a step back and make a referral out to a genuine psychology or counseling professional, as opposed to sort of trying to kind of play amateur psychologist.
So if me and you are sitting in a meeting with a client or potential client, what are some signs that would lead you to believe that we are not the right person for them and that they would need more of a therapist or financial coach?
I think first and foremost, there is just sort of a rare but obvious case of a person who is exhibiting extremely high levels of anxiety or what we would call kind of trait neuroticism in the big five or ocean trait sense. So simply put, they're just sort of experiencing great levels of negative emotion around their finances in a way that is not kind of rationally articulable. There's common things where clients will say something like, the market's going down and I'm scared. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a person who is essentially communicating on such a level of anxiety or concern that is just well beyond what is appropriate for their circumstances or what their concerns are about. I think another one, and a particular one that I think is even tougher to sort of make a referral to, because sometimes you sort of risk offending the parties, are couples who are miscommunicating. I'll give you an example from a couple of years ago. A client couple came in. They had almost $1 million to be invested in and save and live on and so on, and they ended up essentially screaming at each other over whether specifically the wife's social security, which was $800 a month, should be going into her personal checking, and then she should be divvying up a portion of that into their joint checking account, or whether it should go into the joint checking account and then a small portion should be divvied out to her personal checking. Net numbers exactly the same on either side of this, absolutely no difference whatsoever, but they could not, for the life of them, communicate a level of empathy and understanding that she felt a little bit anxious that she wouldn't have any control over their finances if her social security was going into the joint account, and in turn she could not recognize for him that he just saw that as a complete lack of trust on her part. And so they just went in this knockdown, screaming, circle, shouting match for the better part of half an hour before we kind of had to draw the line and say, okay, I'm sorry, you are not speaking civilly with each other, and that we are not going to get anywhere if we can't even get past that. So sometimes it's very, very obvious. I think other cases are cases where you just sort of recognize self sabotage in a client, where they have the income or they have the means, but you are having this sort of Groundhog Day conversation about how they're rationalizing poor decisions. Hey, I got laid off, and so I decided to cash out my 401k. Well, this is the third time you've gotten laid off, and the third time you've cashed out your 401k. We've talked about it every single time, and you keep doing it. Or, hey, you keep saying your biggest goal is to get out of debt, and we'll build a debt pay down plan, and then implement it and you pay off the debts that we had planned on a year ago, and now that we're a year on, you've paid those off, and oh, by the way, now you're telling me you took out a bunch of other loans at the same time, right? And now your biggest concern is paying off these new debts that you accrued while you were paying off the other debts. So it's just recognizing where at some point the advice, the technicals, and the financial side are well established. The client openly acknowledges, yes, we should do this, I agree, but then they're not implementing, and there's not a certain level of hand holding that you're either able to provide, or in turn, there doesn't seem to be a level of hand holding that's solving the problem, where you then need to say, okay, this is clearly more intrinsically driven than extrinsically driven, and I need a professional to step in and help solve this.
A lot of really good points in there. I think we share a similar perspective on this topic. I think you said something along the lines the other day of, our job is to give advice, but of equal or even greater importance, it's also to implement and make sure things actually get done for clients. And I could see situations where if we dove into these squishier topics more in depth than we currently do, nothing will ever get done on the actual implementation side of things. So striking that balance between the two, I think is really important because clients definitely do need some behavioral coaching with some aspects of their plan, but at the same time, our job is to make sure that they are getting the things they need to get done completed. So thanks for that perspective as well.
No, I mean, happy to provide it, and I'll just cap off again by sort of reiterating. I think it's great for financial planners to learn about financial psychology and behavioral finance. I think it's great to want to take classes or do readings or courses on how to apply, certain techniques to be a better conversationalist, to be better at listening, be better at recognizing your clients' anxieties and helping address them, and so on. It's just very, very important that we recognize that, you know financial counselors, financial psychologists, therapists, psychiatrists are their completely own discipline, have a complete own realm of expertise and training and practice, and it behooves us to recognize the line between what we can do for our clients and what they can do for our clients, in the same way that we recognize the line between what competent attorneys and tax professionals can do for our clients.
Great.
Well, Daniel, I think we're kind of at the end of our time here, but as always, the tradition remains strong. So, what is it that you have learned in this past week that you want to share with the audience?
I think I'm going to provide two learnings this week. One is probably less of a learning and more of just a thought that I had, and I think something we could implement into this industry. And we talked about this, Dan. So over the weekend, I went to my girlfriend's white coat ceremony, which is a lovely ceremony for aspiring medical students when they're starting their journey to become a doctor. And financial planning, personally, I think is a very important profession. We're not saving people's lives literally, but we are a big reason for some folks while they're able to do the things they want to do. And it was really inspiring to me to see simply how much importance they put on the profession and how meaningful it was not only to the people they serve, but how meaningful it is to them and their families as well. And I think just being there and seeing that from a serious and competent profession made me think, we have so much work to do and we have so much that we can still tackle within the financial planning profession to make it an admirable and worthy place to work. And I think that's just a really inspiring thought. And I like to keep that in the back of my head as we move forward in this year. I think in addition to that, earlier this week, I read a quote that I simply love from Nick Murray talking about how temporary market declines are not permanent losses. And with a lot of the fluctuations in the market recently, I think that's a really important quote to think about because the market will go down. And it actually goes down, one of every 4 quarters if we start to average it out. But a lot of people forget that. And I think a lot of people, they look at the S&P and they see that it's averaging 8%, but they look at the current year and it's out of whack and it confuses a lot of people. But I think just recognizing that temporary losses will happen, but that doesn't mean they're permanent losses for you is an extremely important topic to broach with clients because it kind of goes back to the behavioral thing and coaching them through some of these more difficult times and making sure they get through those difficult times unscathed and in good financial position still.
Very wise and great observations. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.